All right, Tobias, again, not the NBA basketball player, but the Japanese analyst whose Substack you should all be subscribing to, I'm subscribed as well, is back to talk to us about, pretty surprising Japanese election result. Good to see you, Tobias.
Good to see you, Jacob. Thanks for having me back.
A pleasure, and thank you for taking time. I know that you are probably the prettiest girl at the dance right now. I was telling listeners, like, I have a bevy of podcasts, and I've been traveling the last couple of weeks, traveling the upcoming week, so I have not done as much prep work as I like to before a podcast. So I'll be a good surrogate listener because I'm going to ask you what may feel like basic questions. But tell the listeners what happened in Japan's elections and why it was such a surprise. What was the expectation and what actually happened?
Well, I mean, we've really had a pretty monumental, let's say, 6 weeks or so now, where maybe even longer, going back to July with the upper house elections. But we ended up in this situation where throughout August we had this: will Ishiba go or will he stay? And can he resist the pressure? And they went back and forth. And then finally, the LDP did its election postmortem and said, actually, there were a lot of things that he failed to do that contributed to the party's loss, and it basically became inevitable that he was going to leave. So early September, he announces that he's going to resign, opens the way for the second LDP leadership election in as many years. And we ended up getting, compared to last year, where it was really almost like a 4 or 5 week, 9 candidates crisscrossing the country, having lots of events. And this year was much more subdued. I mean, in part because you had 5 candidates instead of 9. They were all candidates who ran last year. They were all familiar. And I think there was a sense, too, that in contrast to last year when, you hadn't had a general election, the LDP still had its majorities. I think there was a recognition that things were more complicated, that it was hard to make overly ambitious promises. Just keep that in the back of your minds for a second, because I think we will have to come back to that. Kind of a sense of, well, we're competing to lead a party with a minority government. And so I think there was a sense, it was more subdued. It was a little more, the sense of constraint and difficulty, I think, was higher. And so it was a shorter campaign. But it did end up being surprising because in contrast to expectations, and if you look at the betting markets and if you looked at the polls, it certainly looked like Koizumi Shinjiro was going to win this time around. And what you ended up getting instead was a fairly surprising victory by Takaichi Sanai, the right-wing candidate. And she prevailed on October 4th. And you would think, okay, well, in the past, you win the LDP leadership election. That means you're going to be on track to become prime minister. And actually what happened instead was a pretty dramatic scramble. First, the LDP ended, or rather its coalition with the Buddhist party Komeito ended after 26 years because they did not like the terms that Takaichi was offering. And that meant that the LDP was going to have a pretty big hole to make up to ensure that Takaichi did win the premiership. And it also gave a group of opposition parties a window of opportunity to try to organize a counter campaign to elect their own prime minister. So you had this like mad scramble over the course of 10 days. And in the end, the LDP did pry away one of the opposition parties, Isshin Tokai, and had enough votes to secure Takaichi's election. That happened Tuesday. So that's basically that's like the capsule version of the last 6 weeks. I mean, it's been a pretty wild period for Japanese politics.
Yeah, and probably, I mean, I don't know. You'll tell me whether we should get used to this. This is sort of what Japanese politics was like before Abe dominated the scene. Is that a fair characterization?
Not entirely. I mean, there have been periods. I mean, the period that the last couple of weeks most closely resembled. I mean, this was sort of before my time, but really the early to mid 90s where. The LDP in 1993 lost its majority. You ended up getting this 7-party opposition coalition taking power. That didn't last that long. Then you got this weird LDP-led coalition with the socialists, and that's on everyone's mind because the prime minister who led that, Murayama, he died last week. So everyone was sort of thinking back to these moments. So you've had moments of more or less fragmentation. Because what really happened in the first decade of this century was uncertainty that really had more to do with the fact that Japan was exploring possibly having a 2-party system and sort of the tensions and the competition that came with that. Not so much the fragmentation, but what we're really experiencing now is a sense that there's actually no there does not seem to be a political force that is capable of mustering a majority. And as
Mm.
a result, you have, the LDP is short of a majority. You have this group of opposition parties, none of which is able to really command a majority. And so power is more diffuse. There's a lot more bargaining. There's a lot more negotiation that has to go on to govern. And that situation seems likely to continue. I mean, I guess we'll talk more about whether Takaichi has the mojo, I guess, to break that. But for the moment, I mean, that fragmentation really is the reality that Japan faces now.
Yeah. So before we dive into that, I think we would be remiss if we didn't pour one out for Shigeru Ishiba. I think from reading you that you're sympathetic to him. I'll tell you that I've had a little bit of trouble being as objective as I usually am because I just like him. Like I've liked him from the very beginning. He seemed like an underdog. He seems to be a really thoughtful, figure. And he always, I mean, you talked on one of our podcasts about he seemed from the very start as like a tragic figure, somebody who was even aware that he was not going to get to the finish line of all the ambitious goals that he had. And you put out a really nice piece about him as an idealist. Versus the bureaucratic power element that is in Japanese politics. So before we turn to Akaichi and all the fun things that are happening, why don't I just set you up there to talk about to say goodbye to Shigeru Ishiba and to talk a little bit about that contrast in idealism and bureaucratic politics, because it does seem to be very present, and it's going to be very present in Japan's relations with the U.S. and relations with China, even in domestic policy.
Yeah, I mean, it was unfortunate. As Mark said, that leaders don't, you don't get to pick the circumstances that you find yourself in, and he, uh, was obviously someone who, had really thought for a long time about the kind of country Japan should be and that he wanted it to be. And, in some ways he wanted it to be a kinder country, a country where, there's more emphasis on trust and uh, solidarity and uh, cooperation, and just wanted to sort of smooth over the rough edges of political conflict. And uh, I'd like to think of him and some of the other parts of his part of the party as more of their one nation conservatives. That they want to speak for the entire country, and they don't want to stoke division. They want to heal division. And he, in some ways, that made him actually well suited for the moment that he faced, because within weeks of taking office, he ended up as the head of a minority government, and it was a government
Mm-hmm.
that had to do a lot of negotiation. If he was going to get anything done, he had to talk to opposition parties. And he actually, I mean, to his credit, actually did a um, a reasonable job at it. I mean, by one metric, he could have easily wound up facing a no confidence motion, because the opposition parties had enough votes to pass one in theory, and ultimately he made enough deals and found a way to work with sort of one partner and then another, that he basically pushed off. Um, a no confidence motion, and so in that sense, he kind of won a game. It wasn't the ultimate game of survival, but he did manage that one. But I mean, ultimately, this was, he inherited an LDP that had really lost the public's trust. He inherited a political system that really is actually, I think, going through um, quite a significant period of transition. And in some ways, it's Japan converging to other democracies, where you are seeing, I think, a pretty big disconnect between the old and the young. And, that is causing, I think, all sorts of weirdness and all sorts of changes. And I think it really contributed to some of the problems the LDP has had, and that it feels very out of touch. And, here's someone he had been in politics since, the 1980s, and, came from a very, uh, really one of Japan's poorest, most rural prefectures, very out of touch with young urban voters and the issues they faced. And so, just like did not really seem to be the man for the moment, did not really seem to have the answers, to the policy issues that the country was facing, the economic problems that people are facing, um, and just, not a character able to generate excitement. And ultimately, I think that ultimately is what did him in. He didn't pick the circumstances. He did the best he could. I think he also, we should say, probably did, really as best he could in talking with the United States. Given, um, you know, Trump was going to demand what he was going to demand, and that he was going to have to make some kind of deal, and it was probably going to be a deal on more favorable terms for the United States than for Japan. And so, again, did the best he could, I think, given the circumstances. Um, but ultimately, probably a man, not the right man for the moment, ultimately. And I think, that really is what led the party to move on from him, I think, in the end.
Do you think he has a career going forward, or is this it? Have we seen the last of him?
I don't expect him to have a comeback in him. It's this is maybe this is a transition to talking about Takaichi, but I mean it's pretty remarkable actually. She's the first Japanese prime minister born after 1960, and she was born in 1961. So there's really been this stubborn feeling of generational change. Waiting for um, you leadership that is closer to the issues that a lot of voters are facing, um, that have come of age in a different time. And even Takaichi being born in, she entered politics. She was elected to the Diet in 1993. So same year Abe was elected, same year Kishida was first elected. So there is a feeling that when are you really going to see generational change? When are you really going to see um, a shift to a generation that really has come of age in, the post-economic bubble world, the post-Cold War world? You're still waiting for that move um, that hasn't quite happened yet.
Yeah, I mean, to put that into reference for our U.S.-based listeners, Barack Obama today is 64 years old. So it's quite a thing that we're describing. We're embracing a younger generation for somebody who, I mean, compared to Donald Trump, she's a spring chicken. But I mean, she's still somebody who's relatively old. We should also say she's the first female prime minister in Japan's history. Is there anything you want to say about that? I mean, that feels pretty notable in a society that has maybe a stereotypical reputation, but a reputation for being fairly patriarchal and for women not sort of being at the front of the pack. And here is Takaichi not only at the front of the pack, but like seems to be the firebrand, seems to be the one that has ideas, that is strong, that is going to move. It's a very interesting subversion of what you would expect, I think, from the stereotype.
Well, given that the LDP has provided virtually all of Japan's prime ministers back to 1955, I mean, it was going to have to be someone in the LDP. The odds were better than not. The thing about the LDP, the LDP as of now, among its Diet members, fewer than 10% are women. So, it is still a party that is, very dominated by men. I mean, the other unusual thing about her is that, I mean, she really comes from a, relatively modest background. She's not a hereditary politician. She's not a dynastic politician. She's not, the relative grandchild of a prime minister or other senior politician. I mean, she really is unusual in that way, in that she, came from, pretty humble background. Um, her parents basically said, like, we don't want you even, she could have gone to, an elite school in Tokyo, and her parents told her not to, stay closer to home, go to, pretty, not a pretty well-known college or anything like that. But she, really clawed her way into politics on her own kind of strength and her own ambition. And you can't really tell the story of her career though without her relationship with Abe. And Abe really was her patron. And the first time she became a cabinet minister was when he became prime minister for the first time in 2006. And she was really part of his circle of loyalists. She was very devoted to him and supported him, and and he in turn helped her advance. And and that's, look, I mean, for men or women, you need patrons. You need someone who is helping you, along. But I think for a woman, particularly in the period in which she has, her career has unfolded, I mean, it's hard to imagine it happening, in the absence of a powerful patron like Abe, particularly because she's not a hereditary politician. I mean, when you look at, like, one of the other more prominent female Japanese politicians. So Obuchi Yuko, okay, her father was a prime minister, and she's, um, that certainly helped her. It's like, so, not having those resources, um, she, needed that kind of support. And so, she was loyal to Abe, and Abe repaid that loyalty in return. And it certainly helped her be in a position for, as he receded, first as he stepped back from the premiership, and then as he was assassinated in 2022. I mean, she was well positioned to emerge as the leader of that part of the party. That
Hmm.
having been, trusted by him, close to him, uh, and then when she ran for the leadership for the first time in 2021, basically having him as her campaign manager, uh, that went a long way, I think, to position her, as the heir to his movement, versus some of the other, maybe male contenders.
Yeah. Um, when you were first talking, it sort of sounded like maybe there was a Thatcher comparison to be made, but I don't know. With the Abe patronship, it doesn't sound like there is. And am I also reading you correct that we shouldn't read into her election as any kind of fundamental change in like gender inside of Japan itself? She's more of an exception than she is some kind of shattering of a glass ceiling. Am I being too cynical?
I mean, you know, it's it's a meaningful achievement, but clearly it was something that, really, well, and look, I don't want to downplay her own political talents. I think she, has a genuinely strong, devoted following, and I mean, it made this possible that she really does have, real supporters on the grassroots who, really, I think, genuinely are affectionate for her. Particularly, like you look at these like rallies she has. I mean, she really has, I think, a very strong following. I think she has, an extraordinary work ethic. This is something which probably actually is like a Thatcher comparison that maybe is apt, but she just, I think, um, there's a sense that she's going to out hustle her opponents. She's going to work harder than them. She's willing to put in the hours. Ishiba, after she won, like teased her, about making sure she remembers work life balance. Like, she's, I mean, but she's, like has real abilities. She's, I think she is uh, has extraordinary command of policy details. I mean, you watch her give these press
Mm.
conferences, and it's just, like her ability to just sort of reel off facts, almost without coming up for air. I mean, it's like I mean, it's almost, when I watch them, I mean, you just realize like, wow, she is just like going on and on. I mean, really knows, um, you know, knows the issues extraordinarily well. So is formidable in her own right, and I want to stress that, this is not just like, oh well, she was just given this thing and didn't earn it. I mean, there were, she has real talents that, uh, and so essentially she was, given the opportunity because she had those talents. If she didn't have the talents, I don't think she gets where she is now. So,
Yeah, of course.
I want to make sure that that is clear. Um, but she, in terms of, is this the glass ceiling shattering? I mean, the real challenge, again, LDP has only, you know, 10% of its national lawmakers are women. So there's some work to do, just because, it's a parliamentary system. So how do you get ahead? I mean, you have to serve the time. You have to, be around, you have to climb the ladder. And if you're not getting on the ladder in the first place, that's very hard to do. And I think one thing she is going to do, um, is try to help women climb the ladder. So when you look at who's in both cabinet and sub cabinet, positions in her government, uh, of those 38 women in the Diet, from the LDP, more than 25% of them are now in government posts of one sort or another. So, she's
Mhm.
going to really, I think she really is trying to cultivate kind of the next generation of female leaders within the LDP and give them those opportunities to move up. Um, so, it certainly, I think the, whether it's the glass ceiling, has been shattered, or just, maybe it's the wrong metaphor, and it just has the, you know more doors are opened, or the bar is lower, or whatever it is. I mean, I think,
No,
you know,
that's a great point. More doors are open for women than ever before in Japanese politics, and I mean they weren't open at all. So I mean
yeah.
it's something that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, look, and also look, we now have the first female finance minister. Haven't had a female finance minister before, so it's things. There are opportunities, and I think she's working on creating those opportunities. And so, um, you know, she has generally, I mean, this during this leadership campaign, she, I think, talked it up a little more. But in the past, has generally not tried to make a lot of you know trying to get a lot of political credit out of being a candidate to become the first female prime minister. It was generally not how she did not want to win on that basis. She wanted to win because of her ideas and her talents and her skills. um, and ultimately that is why she won. I don't think she won necessarily because people you know were drawn to vote for her just because she'd be the first female prime minister. But um, that did seem to be played up a little more during this leadership campaign than in the past.
Hmm. One of the interesting things, or one of the things that makes her different, also, is that she's coming into power with far higher approval ratings than any of her predecessors. So, I mean, maybe Japanese politics is still, maybe the LDP can't command majorities and things like that, but she at least seems to have a honeymoon period that she's going to walk into. To what do you ascribe that? And do you think, is there any staying power to that? When Abe was assassinated, I wondered if there wasn't going to be some kind of groundswell of support for his policies that never really materialized. Like, it didn't really move things forward. Japan just continued in this direction. But she seems to have a bigger mandate than anybody that preceded her, aside from Abe, or at least anybody who has tried to do anything in Japanese politics since Abe. So, can she do anything with that? Is she stuck with the LDP not having the same broad appeal that it did before? Like, how do you think that plays into her next moves?
Um, I mean, it's certainly better to start with higher approval ratings than not. I mean, so um, off the bat, it's a better position to be in than where her immediate predecessors were starting from. And I think there's a few factors to that. I do think there's um, some of it is just I think people are uh, gratified to see the first female prime minister, and so I think there's a bit of a kind of maybe like a halo effect from being the first female prime minister in this historic moment for Japan. Uh, the thing we are seeing is young voters are drawn to her, and on Blue Sky this morning, I was going back and forth with some other Japan politics watchers, just trying to why are we seeing this? I mean, and because it's not just why are we seeing such strong support from the young for her, like in the Yomiuri Shimbun poll that came out yesterday. I mean, her support from voters under 40 is 80%. Ishiba's was 15%. So that's weird and unusual. But the same voters, those same under 40 voters, are the same voters who, in July were voting for, this, populist right party Sanseto, the same voters who are
Hmm.
voting for the populist right Democratic Party for the People. I mean, so, is it that young voters just are more right wing? Is it that, um, young voters are just more online, and there is this sort of uh, culture, sort of right wing culture online, and so there's sort of a bent to the information they're receiving about politics online. Is it that um, is it and I think there might be another more of like a vibes rather than ideology way of thinking about it, where Abe had pretty robust support from the young when he was prime minister, and I thought some of it was, um, some of it was just Abenomics was good for young people. If you were leaving school and entering the job market, those were pretty good years to be doing that. Wages were finally going up. You basically, the jobs to the worker to jobs ratio was very favorable for workers. You had your pick of job.
Hmm.
So those were not bad years to be a young person, but also to what extent was it voters respond to energetic leadership. and I think it also explained why Koizumi was as popular as he was back in the day. That, it's not even so much about what is this leader actually saying they're going to do, but a leader who presents vigor, a leader who presents energy, a leader who, is speaking directly to the people, who, you can go see and they have, energy at their rallies like that. Like, people respond to that. And, I think young voters in particular seem to be responding to that. So, it's probably some mix of all the above. Some of it probably is, young people are maybe more conservative, and we've seen this maybe in other democracies. Um, but I think in contrast to Ishiba, in contrast to Kishida, she looks more energetic. She looks like someone who, is going to provide dynamic leadership. It is not just going to be, old LDP just like sitting here, twiddling their thumbs, not really doing anything. And so it's possible that it's a response to that, um,
Hmm.
as much as anything else. I mean, and the last thing, actually, when we look, Abe was always more popular than his policies. His approval ratings were pretty robust kind of throughout his tenure, um, but he generally pulled better than the things that he wanted to do, which means that, for Takaichi, I mean, that maybe is a cautionary tale, um, not to uh, not to interpret high approval ratings as necessarily a mandate to do whatever you want. And that was something I think Abe was always sort of careful about, and sort of picking his battles, and knowing when to push ahead and when to compromise and when to pull back. And that's, the secret to longevity in some ways, um, is being able to read those opportunities, and kind of have have an ability to sort of intuit where the public's mood is.
Hmm. Well, that's a good segue. So, policy-wise, what are we expecting from her? I know that she's, in my brief look at this, she's talked about continuing Abenomics in a weird way. So maybe we're talking about, I mean, Japan, it looked like was finally starting to raise rates. Are we going to go back to that sort of thing? And then there's the question of relations with the U.S. There's the questions of relations with China. There's the question of rice prices, which they've been down for a couple of weeks, but we're still at, extreme highs. Although I saw something from, I think, her new agricultural minister that they were worried now about an oversupply that would kill farmers next year. So, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Take us through the policy landscape for her, and what changes we should expect, if any, as a result of what her priorities are going to be.
So she has taken office sounding very ambitious, very, not wanting to, um, in some ways, wanting to overcome the political constraints she faces. And that's right. I mean, there's going to be this tension, uh, in her government. And I mean, at least we're really seeing this at the start, where she has things she wants to do. She is, um, you can call her an Abeist or a neo-Abeist or whatever, which, I mean, really what it fundamentally means is, at least what I mean, I think about it as, Japan faces a dangerous world, an increasingly dangerous world, and it is the responsibility of the Japanese state to defend the lives and liberty and property of the Japanese people from the dangers that are out there. And that was very much, I think, how Abe approached things. And it is even more, I think, how she thinks about what needs to be done. And so, I mean, everything is through that lens of, she talks about economic security, she talks about food security, she talks about energy security, she talks about national security. I mean, all of this, I mean, fundamentally, that is, how she, the lens through which she is viewing what has to get done. Uh, but that agenda then has to compete with the fact that, yes, she has a coalition partner, Isshin no Kai, that shares a lot of these goals. But between the two of them, they're still just short of a majority. They still have to find some other group or grouping that is willing to sign on to whatever they want to do. And I mean, she did manage to add a few of those votes in the lower house to win the premiership on the first ballot in the lower house, on Tuesday. So, those votes maybe are gettable. But Isshin no Kai is, uh, potentially a mercurial partner is a partner that has decided that it doesn't actually want to be. It is a coalition partner outside of the cabinet, so it faces lower barriers to exit. It is in a position to, if they don't like what she's doing, they can pull the plug and just say we're out. This isn't working for us. So, um, it is a more precarious position. Maybe a slightly better position than Ishiba had been in, where, he had the LDP's longstanding coalition partner Komoto, but uh, they were still short of a majority and had to negotiate and had to, peel off, some opposition party or another to do anything. And it was time consuming and it was not the easiest way to govern. And I think it led Ishiba to scale back his ambitions. Um, so I think Takaichi has taken the lesson: don't scale back your ambitions, but you still have real political constraints, and I think real um, challenges to getting things done. And so she's going to have to, navigate that. How do you convert your ambitions into reality when it may not take much for the political reality to really bite back.
Yeah. What do you think she's going to do in terms of fiscal policy? Because I mean, I saw that quote that you put of hers when she said the goal of fiscal policy is not just to balance the books; it's about leaving a growing Japan to the future, and then some flowery language afterwards. So, what do we think that means in practical terms? Like, what do you think are the fiscal moves that she's going to push?
So, I mean, like this, really comes back to this idea of building a strong state, and and to have a strong state, you need a strong economy. But all of that, I mean, that really was kind of the Abe approach, and so she is
Mhm.
continuing that. And the thing to understand is that Japan's modern monetary theorists, this idea that deficits don't matter and that you can, that the fiscal limits that more conventional economics says, all governments face are not as binding. Uh, Japan's modern monetary theorists are on the right; they're not on the left.
Mhm.
Because ultimately these are the people in Japanese politics who, there are things that have to get done, and probably top of that list is defense spending. Japan has to spend more on defense. It has to have more autonomous capabilities, and we're not going to let those penny pinchers at the finance ministry tell us we can't do it. Like that's why that quote stood out to me. And that wasn't Takaichi, that was her finance minister, but
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
it echoes the kind of things that we've heard from um, from her before. I mean, that's why I thought it was useful, but just as like a single phrase that really captures, I think, the attitude that like there are things we need to do, and we're not going to let the finance ministry stop us. Um, and that is the mindset. And so you know, so last year when she ran for the leadership and didn't win, I think she leaned much more into deficits don't matter. We can spend more. We can, like we can deal with this. And there are things we have to do. There are strategic investments we have to do, and we're not going to let that stop us. She, and also was much more explicit in pushing back against the BOJ's plans to normalize, and raise rates and all of that. I think this year she scaled that back somewhat, and I don't know to what extent that was, well, maybe I should moderate a little bit to try to win, or the fact that the bond market has been speaking this year rather loudly, and um, maybe being cognizant of not wanting to trigger kind of adverse market reactions and being maybe a little more cautious about her language. But fundamentally, I mean, look, I think her philosophy is Japan, the fiscal constraints that many worry about are not as binding as some think, and there's more room for it. And um, there's certainly a bias towards spending more if there are needs that have to be funded. And so that's the inclination. Practically speaking, um, she still has to work with Ishin to pass a budget. And so Ishin's preferences are going to shape things. Um, and there is a slight difference between Ishin's mindset, and I think hers, where so I did an interview the other day, and I talked about her as basically like a military Keynesian. Um, Ishin is actually kind of more conventional neoliberal, like small government, deregulation, finding ways to, like one of the things they demanded the LDP promised to do was create basically Japan's answer to Doge, to review inefficient spending and find cost savings. And so they're not necessarily free spending. I mean, they have things that they want the government to spend on, but they want um, they think there's ways of getting savings, by making the government more efficient. So that's, I mean, there's a slight tension there in terms of kind of the mindset and the approach between the two parties.
Hmm. It's funny. I was one of the events I did last week. There were some folks in the American aquatics fisheries space there, and after my presentation, one of them sat down next to me at dinner and said, "So tell me, why is the yen so weak against the dollar, and when will it change?" And he might even be listening right now. I wouldn't be expecting much strength from the yen if what Tobias just said is correct. Um, Maybe let's talk a little bit about foreign policy. Abe, it's funny, like if you followed through on what Abe said, you would have thought that it was going to bring Japan and China into great power conflicts sooner rather than later. But he was also a masterful diplomat with Xi Jinping. Arguably, Japanese-Chinese relations were, I don't know, better than they have been in a generation. Maybe I'm speaking out of turn there, but what do you think is going to be Takaichi's approach with China? Because that's obviously the dragon in the room that she's going to have to deal with.
um, I mean, in some ways, the constraints and the challenges that every Japanese prime minister has to face in China are the same. Where the military threat is real. The threat of um, tension over territorial disputes is real. Uh, the sort of risks of over dependence on China, of Chinese overproduction, of Chinese intellectual property theft, of Chinese now increasingly Chinese competition in sectors that Japanese companies have had
Mhm.
market share to themselves, not just domestically but also just all over Southeast Asia and all over the world. uh, Thinking specifically of the auto sector now. um, it's there are real challenges, but there's also a mindset of we live next door to China. We don't have the luxury of an ocean to separate us from China. um, they're big. We're dependent on them. We sell to them. We need their tourists to come. I mean, there's a feeling that you know Japan can't entertain thoughts of decoupling. It's a fantasy for Japan. And so and Abe, there was a memoir published a couple of years ago that came out after he died, and actually there was a great portion of that where he talks about China and put it, I mean, very, like, just in very clear terms about to be a statesman in Japan means yes, acknowledging the threats of China, countering the threats of China, approaching China from a position of strength, but ultimately the test of being a Japanese statesman is being able to talk to China too. And so I think Takaichi understands that. I think there was a moment on the campaign actually where she might have even explicitly cited either those words or something else Abe said to that effect. And so she certainly understands the challenge. She is not someone who is going to push for decoupling, but she's also someone who is at least as cognizant of the security challenges, if not more so, than pretty much anyone else. And so um, there's walking that tightrope is going to be hard. Things. There's been sort of cautious progress in just reopening political communication between Japan and China over the last year or so. Um, that is preserving that is going to be hard. And it is a bilateral relationship too, where every time you feel like there's progress, there's something they stumble over. So it's there was this issue where China had stopped importing uh, fisheries products from Japan because of that uh, treated water from the Fukushima Daiichi
Hmm.
nuclear plant had been dumped into the ocean, and they said, well, this is dangerous, and therefore we're not importing any fisheries from Japan. And so they finally made progress on that. Um, but then now you've had this issue with attacks on Japanese nationals in China, and concern about the safety of Japanese nationals, and Japanese nationals being arrested on espionage charges, and so that's turned into an issue. And you've had Chinese development near the dividing line in the East China Sea. That's an issue. So you just have just like there's always something that seems to be kind of complicating those efforts to put relationship on a little more stable footing. And Takaichi's going to have to navigate those, but I don't that's not unique to her. She
Yeah.
has and the issue with her maybe is look, when she has talked about Japan's wartime past, I mean, she is firmly in what you might call a more revisionist camp, and downplaying the significance of that history. Wanting the kind of watchword for this school of thought is the Japanese have to feel proud of their history, and um, the potential for that being a source of friction with China and also with South Korea is very real. She is someone who has been a regular visitor to Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. She has not said whether she will go as prime minister or not, but it's certainly a live possibility. And these are things that have to be, um, yeah, we just have to be mindful of them as potential irritants, in that relationship.
Yeah, I take your point about, I mean, the Japan China relationship is sort of locked in. The one that feels like it has, at least to me, that has a lot more potential for volatility, you just alluded to, and I think we should spend a little bit of time on it, which is South Korea. You know, back in 2019, we were talking about a mini trade war between Japan and South Korea, and between revisionist Japanese government and a dovish South Korean government that didn't like any of what was going on. You had a real breakdown in ties there. I think one of the things that the Biden administration did that it has not been given enough credit for is the way it stitched Japanese and South Korean relations back together. It was one of their huge foreign policy successes from my point of view. Um, but man, if you have Takaichi the way that you're talking about her, and then you have President Lee in South Korea, who he's been very pragmatic, but his ideological credentials are towards the dovish side, towards the left. And then you've got, I've made this joke on the podcast a couple times, but we've heard from Venezuela this year, we've heard from Iran, we've heard from just about everybody except North Korea. And I did see that North Korea tested a missile or something right after Takaichi won. So talk to me a little bit about that, because that seems to be I should also say, South Korea, President Lee just a couple of days ago, gave a presentation at a big some kind of expo for aviation and military hardware and things like that, and basically said, yeah, we need to be self-reliant on defense by 2030. We're going to throw a bunch of money in R&D into making sure that South Korea is a self-reliant military power by 2030, and we're going to export to the rest of the world. If I was Takaichi or somebody in Takaichi's government, I think I would sit up in my chair a little bit to hear that the South Koreans are talking about that, and sort of being able to talk about getting rid of the U.S. security umbrella, not because the U.S. says it, but because South Korea says it. Also, funnily enough, I'm literally having a podcast this evening with a South Korea analyst, so I will invert this question for them when I talk to them later. But curious how you're seeing Japan-South Korea relations, and whether I'm right in sensing that that's the place where we should be looking for the most volatility.
I mean, there's certainly a risk. Um, the combination of left wing Korean president and right wing Japanese prime minister. I mean, the last time we saw that combination, as you alluded
Not
to,
great.
did not go very well. There is, but that also means there's an opportunity. That if Takaichi is able to be more pragmatic about South Korea in a way that we have seen Lee be pragmatic, um, there's a real opportunity to make this a more durable partnership where there is a recognition actually that South Korea and Japan in many ways are in the same boat. That the reliability of the United States as an ally to both is not what it was, and they both are dealing with a China threat and a North Korea threat and a Russia threat, and face the similar challenges of being essentially on the front lines facing three nuclear armed authoritarian countries, that countries that are increasingly drawing together. And so there's an opportunity, and if Takaichi is willing to take it, um, it could be a huge moment. And I will say that her initial comments about South Korea have been more encouraging. I mean, I think acknowledging the importance, acknowledging the value of what has been done uh, in in recent years, and so at the very least, there's a chance for hope. I will say Takaichi just appointed her a new national security advisor, which was somewhat unusual in that the current one had just taken over in January, and it's not necessarily something that changes just because you get a new prime minister. But she picked her guy, and he met his South Korean counterpart uh, the day he took over. So in Tokyo, there's potentially um, a real possibility that actually she recognizes the strategic value. Japan needs all the friends it can get, and that building on the work that is done with South Korea is worth doing. The question is, though, what happens um, when something happens? Does she go to Yasukuni? Does she um, say something about some history issue at some event that gets South Koreans upset? Or, like with Abe, it was, there's lawsuits in Korean courts. I mean, I haven't checked to see what Korean activists are
Mm-hmm.
doing lately, but, um, do you have something coming from that direction? When is there an anniversary and Takaichi says something or Lee says something, and you get sort of a war of words on that front, or some Korean goes to Dokdo, or Japanese cabinet ministers go to Takashima Day. It's like when you have it's good that they're saying the right things now. The question is, when the stress test comes, what happens then? Is there going to be enough commitment to actually there's a lot of strategic value in this, and we have to get through this. Um, is there going to be enough um, commitment on both sides to push through that when it happens? Or do they fall
Mm-hmm.
back sort of into the familiar cycles of recriminations and tit for tat, measures and so on? And so that's really going to be the test.
And then the last big one is the United States. I was struck at how, I mean, you're right that Ishiba, did what he needed to do in the context of the United States. He also had some pretty strident commentary on how Japan needed to become more self-reliant itself, and that the tariffs were something like a national security crisis for Japan. Um, and I feel like I could see this going to one of two ways for Takaichi. Either no, like Japan needs to be arm in arm with the United States because it needs to do all these things, or Japan will not tolerate being treated like a second-class power by the United States. It also needs to be able to be self-reliant from that point of view. So early indications suggest that relations will be good. And we know that President Trump has fond memories of Abe, and just the whiff of Abe in Japanese politics will probably, make Trump willing to make some concessions, or at least be nicer than the U.S. was under Ishiba. But how do you see Japan-U.S. relations from here? And if we're let's use President Lee's metric by 2030. Like, what do Japan-U.S. relations look like? Do you think they're back on steadier footing because we've gotten through this round of trade recriminations, or are we looking at something fundamentally different? And what role does someone like Takaichi play in that evolution?
Uh, so, the first thing about her, and this comes back to we talked about earlier, that her first cardinal principle is that Japan needs to be more independent and needs to be more capable on its own and essentially standing on its own 2 feet. And it can't look to Washington for its defense. Um, at the most basic level. And so she's someone who does want to spend more on defense, not to make Japan a better ally of the United States, but to make Japan, essentially to be a better ally by being able to defend itself on its own, to have
Mm-hmm.
capabilities on its own. And um, I certainly think, uh, I don't think they're under any illusions in Tokyo about, you know, the reality that, the, this is not the alliance that it was in the past. The United States is looking more inward. It is more focused on its own problems. Uh, it is more focused on its own backyard. It is not thinking nearly as much about uh, the region. I mean, I'm struggling to think about what even the principles of U.S. Asia policy are at the moment, and that Japan has to be, it has to be more capable. It has to be prepared to think about Plan Bs, and that does not mean that therefore Japan is going to say, "All right, Yankee, go home. Like we're done with you." Like I think, obviously they view Japan's security is better with the United States committed to the region and invested in Japan's security and invested in regional security. Uh, but I think the position is they can't take that for granted anymore, and they can't
Mm.
assume that that's that the United States is going to be in the event of a Taiwan contingency that the United States is going to be there. That they just don't know, and so I think so it does come back to first we need to be stronger ourselves. But of course, like let's work with the United States. Let's have a good relationship at a personal level. And I think in the near term, Trump's going to be in Japan next week. I think, I'm sure they will. I'm sure it will go better for her on a personal level than it did for Ishiba, where Trump didn't seem to actually know Ishiba's name. Um, I think the
Gosh.
mutual affection that Takaichi and Trump have for Abe will go a long way. I think uh, to at least getting that personal relationship off on the right foot. Um, but does it change kind of Trump's thinking about the world and what U.S. priorities are? I don't think so. Um, so given that reality, um, there is going to be a greater emphasis on autonomy. Um, and there's going to be a more willingness, greater willingness to push for, more defense spending, and not just to make the United States happy. I mean, I think, Takaichi, in her first press conference, said we're going to move faster to get defense spending to 2% of GDP, and then of course lay the groundwork for going beyond that. That's going to sound good next week when she's meeting with Trump, but she's not doing it just for an audience of one. I mean, this is like
Yeah.
this is a real priority, and so. Um, that I think is really where she is. Um, where are things in 2030? Japan is going to be spending more on defense. I don't know how they get there because there are some real hard constraints about how you pay for it and building a political consensus around paying for it. Um, it's been hard enough figuring out how they were going to pay, for defense spending at 2% of GDP, but you start talking about 3% of GDP or 3.5% of GDP, the money's got to come from somewhere. And, um, you know, they are going to run into some fiscal constraints, like you can't just wave away the fact that interest rates are rising. Um, something's got to give in this situation. So I don't know, how they get to that. Um, but, they're going to push in that direction. It will be, I suspect, by 2030, higher than 2% of GDP. Um, they're going to keep acquiring new capabilities. They're going to keep looking for ways of being able to defend Japan's interest on their own. I suspect the United States will not have pulled its troops out of Japan, so there will still be an alliance. There will still be cooperation with the United States, but Japan's going to be doing more lifting um, when it comes to its own territorial defense.
Yeah, I mean, the adage that all politics is local ultimately is probably the most insightful thing you could say about politics because, I mean, as you sort of already alluded, it'll be up to her whether she can pull the population along with her because the only answer to that fiscal constraint that you're talking about is growth. And Japan is going to have a cultural and socioeconomic moment where they decide to stop sleeping and say, hey, we need like Meiji 2.0. It needs to be full on, like changing completely everything. Because if you don't, like you're probably, you're just shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic, really. And it's funny. I mean, Germany, which is tied to Japanese history for what happened in World War II, is in a very similar position. Like Germany has lots of legacy advantages and things like that, but also has serious demographic issues, less fiscal constraints than Japan has, but needs a full societal effort if it's going to overcome some of its challenges. And I feel that way about Japan in some ways too. Tobias, I'll get you out of here on this. What have I not asked you? What should I have asked you that you think you want to get home to the readers before we leave? Or if we covered it, you can say, great job, Jacob, and we can leave it there.
No, I feel like we, like for this precise moment in time, we're on the second full day of Takaichi. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot we don't know yet, and how she, fundamentally, I mean, this question that we have circled around with is, can she do the thing that I think Abe really learned to do? And if you read my book, this is,
The
really
Iconoclast. It's right
this
behind
is.
his shoulder. It's available on Amazon. It's an excellent read. I'm not just saying that. I loved it. It was great.
I mean, the thing that he really learned to do, and particularly learned between his, unsuccessful first premiership and a second, was how do you balance, those big ideals, those big ambitions with political reality, and sort of, doing the way the Weberian balance, that how do you,
Mm.
you know, how do you move towards your ideals, but um, without losing sight of political realities? And that is something that she's going to have to learn pretty quickly. And maybe she'll be able to do it. Maybe she learned learned from following Abe, and watching him and being around him, and seeing how you do that. Um, but it was something that Abe learned the hard way. Essentially, he really had to, essentially go through the crucible of having a government fall apart around him, before he really learned. And so, she doesn't have a lot of time to figure it out either. So we'll see how this works. But it's not going to be easy, I think.
All right. Well, if it was easy, everyone would do it, right? Tobias, thanks so much. It's good to see you, man.
Thank you, Jake.